If you read the old Icelandic sagas, what sort of culture are you going to discover there? How did the Viking Age came into being? And what do we know about warrior ideology? I've discussed these topics and similar ones with my fellow historian Terri Barnes, and I'm sharing with you the whole conversation in the hope that you will enjoy it as much as we did.
So you investigated the beginnings of the Viking Age, as far as I've seen, or
Yeah,
the
definitely,
causes. Yeah,
definitely a bit of that. Yeah, sort of the run up to it, what's the evolutionary process going on to sort of create something like that. And then also the time frame I'm looking at is like 500 to 900, so I want to get into that first century of it.
okay. So you're trying to integrate also the bit before, like the migration period, and show the more um, the longer causes of the Viking Age, not just the triggers.
Yep. Yep.
Yep. Okay. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, because in my estimation of things, the start of the Viking Age is actually the culmination of something else, right? So
Yeah.
there
Mhm.
has to be something that sort of makes it all possible in order to spark that. So, and then I find like the ninth century to probably be the most interesting for what I'm interested in, and all the escalation and but once they start to sort of get into a little bit more state building and then Christianity comes in, whatever, it's just not the same animal anymore. So, and granted, of course, stupid me, I picked the period that has the least amount of written sources to
Yeah, that's why
rely
I was
on.
going to ask you about the sources, what type of sources you use for
Yeah.
this research mainly.
Well, so I mean, definitely, I'm super interdisciplinary. Before I became an academic, I worked for about 5 years. I also have degrees in art history, and so I worked in
Mm.
museums and managed a private collection. And so I'm not an archaeologist, but I certainly have a hand in material culture. So to me, the sort of idea that as a historian, I would only ever look at written text is just kind of, crazy and ridiculous.
Yeah, no,
So
I also think that material culture should be better integrated somehow. I am under the impression that in the past decades there has been like this really strong specialization on particular topics, and there has been some distance between like those working on literary sources and those working on archaeology and so on. I think we should bring them a little bit together nowadays. And I do like the work that has been done lately, for example, in terms of Old Norse religion. Okay, religion is a bad term to describe it, like a ritual systems of ritual and belief, and the fact that we're trying to integrate material culture, I think is it's very necessary even in this area of mentalities, which is traditionally associated with written sources, because in terms of Old Norse religion there is way too much focus on the Eddas. I mean, I should know. I worked with the Eddas myself,
yeah,
and
yeah.
I'm kind of fed up with it because every time I find some material on this aspect, it has to be the Eddas. So
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, and actually I would talk to my supervisors about, sort of even looking at the sagas, and, initially they're just kind of like, yeah, you don't need to look at the sagas for what you're talking about. And it's kind of like, well, I don't know, so that's why I was, thinking about you and in the discussion, that I mentioned about the sagas as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I've read a few of them, but certainly nowhere near the majority of them or anything. And I feel like for me, I'm trying to get like that 30,000 foot view of like what is the culture that is appearing, by looking at these stories. And I get all the caveats about, the written later and all of that, but it's like, all right, fine, but it's what we have. So let's just, look at what's there. And I'm more in the terms of, sort of the longue durée, the
Mm.
evolutionary process. And so it means looking at a lot of things, even though they may be somewhat problematic in people's estimation, but that it's about pattern recognition, right? And so you're trying to find, okay, well, what does this culture look like? Who are they? What do they value? How do they respond in various situations? And things like that. So that's kind of what I was thinking about with, having a chat with you and your expertise with the sagas of like, all right, if I really want to get a sense of who these people are, what
Mm.
are the key sagas to read? And, for your money, like who are they? What does that culture look like?
Right. Like you said, they are a very tricky source to use. I mean, purely as a historical source, they're rather good to use to figure out some of the mentalities in the 13th and 14th century when they were actually written down. But yeah, if like purely historical sources, I think they're useful if we try to like surgically remove what might seem authentic and what we might corroborate by using other sources. But I think the best way to approach it today is through the lens of memory studies, because memory studies, like, they don't have this obsession with authenticity.
Right.
They have an obsession with the functions of these texts in creating cultural memories, in creating social identities, communal identities, and so on. So I think the sagas are essential in terms of seeing the different ways Icelanders from the High Middle Ages were trying to interpret the past, and they were trying to integrate their ancient past into a coherent story. Because if you think about it, it was not really that distant. So we're talking about a couple of
Exactly.
generations. So
Yep.
they would have still perceived the people they're talking about during the settlement as their ancestors. They wanted a connection with them. So they were wondering, who are these people? What is our relation to them? How can we interpret their behavior? Because they were also different. Some of them were heathen. How can we integrate that kind of story in what we write? So they have more of a value from this point of view, from a memory point of view, but they're also very strongly integrated into the development of literary culture. Like in medieval thought, the difference between history and literature was not really as poignant as nowadays. Like, history was a type of literature,
Yeah.
rather. Um, and yeah, it was a time when, so we have this whole political upheaval going on with Iceland becoming subject to the Norwegian crown in 1262, 1264. That's a milestone in Icelandic history. The two other milestones would be the Christianization around the year 1000 or 999, either way. And then we have the settlement. And the settlement is also something very interesting in Iceland, because it is, I think, one of the few places, well, in Europe, I think it is the only only place where you can actually put a date to the
Yeah.
settlement, because usually it's a huge mess.
Yeah. Yeah.
Europe is a huge mess, but in Iceland, we do know when it happened. Yes, in late 9th century. So you have all these upheavals going on in the 13th and 14th century. And the change in the Commonwealth. So Iceland was more or less democratic until the 13th century, or at least if you compare it with other medieval systems in Europe. I mean, it's also a bit of a myth that it was the first democracy in the world and whatever. That's, yeah, a different story. But yeah, this was also a time of transformation in the sense that the oral traditions were now written down. So you no longer have that very dynamic process going on of gathering stories and hearing this and that, and this whole dynamic exchange between people, but you have a bunch of authors actually writing down the material. So in the moment they write down the material, you have like this solidified memory
Right.
of what the past
Yeah.
looked like. And they are obsessed with a couple of themes. So first of all, it's the settlement.
Yeah.
Second of all, it's religion. So this conflict between heathenism and Christianity. It's also the mix of beliefs as well. And then you have the obsession with laws. So laws are very important in Icelandic sagas, although it's not. I mean, there are a lot of references about how to use the laws to obtain something or to avoid something like a conflict, but we don't really know exactly what those laws were. Yeah, we have the Grey Goose Law code, but then that's also a late source. So yeah, using that to figure out what people were doing in the 9th, 10th century is also a bit. But yeah, laws were used in these stories as sort of like an expression for the good organization they were capable of in the 9th century, and also as an expression, I think, of freedom from Norwegian authority, because this is also a recurrent theme in the sagas of the Icelanders, how bad and vicious the Norwegian king was, Harald Fairhair. And that's actually a reflection of what they would have thought of the problematic relationship and tensions they would have had with the Norwegian crown in the 13th century. So yeah, you do have sagas where Harald Fairhair appears as a vicious villain, because of whom they started mass migrating and then colonizing and settling in Iceland. So yeah, you do have these themes which are recurrent and that they use in order to construct like this collective cultural identity. And I think that's the main merit of and function of these stories.
Yeah. I mean, so that's important to me as far as a collective cultural identity. I mean, if you're trying to identify who this culture is, um, yeah, and I think the interesting part too about the connection to the past, yeah, that's important. I mean, there's several sagas, right? That the very beginning of it is sort of the laying out of the genealogy a little bit,
Oh yeah.
which is that's not unique to the Norse. Other traditions do the same kind of thing, but yeah, I mean, I think that that's a really important thing. It makes me think of, even sort of the job of the law speaker, right? I mean, and if you're going to do
Yeah.
that in an oral way, and you're going to do that kind of recitation, and it's sort of a very ritualized thing, it's like the point is to remind everybody of the connection to the past before we move into the future. And I think it's so hard for people, I think, to get their heads around in this day and age. And I think on my personal Substack, actually, just about a week ago or something, I wrote a post about this, about what happens to us when we, begin to write something down and then
Yeah.
don't have to commit it to memory anymore, and that it changes us in various ways. But then, not the least of which is that when you're looking at something that's, a long ways away from you, then I use the story of like, well, if grandma and grandpa told a story, I heard it, in one way, but my brother heard it in another way. But if I was the one who wrote it down and that's the one that survives into the future, then you can't blame people in the
Right.
future
Yeah.
for reading it and thinking, oh, this is how it was, kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, if you think about the story of Christianization is also a bit dubious. It is like plausible, the fact that it ran in a much more smooth, in a much smoother manner than in other Scandinavian countries, because they had this obsession with like, arbitration and organization and everything being lawful and avoiding conflict and so on. So this is plausible.
Yep.
But then when you think about it, maybe it wasn't like really that smooth, because the story makes like too much sense. I don't know how to put it. And you have like this very, very coherent story, and you need to reflect on the fact that these were Christians writing down. So maybe that was one way, them showing that this would have been the perfect system for Iceland as well.
Yeah.
So you have basically the same story, or the same sort of references in Njol saga, in Kristni saga, in Islendingabók, and so on and so forth. So this is a narration that survived, but there might have circulated other narrations, a bit more conflictual about this whole thing, about this whole problem, tension between heathens and Christians. So.
Yeah, exactly. I actually taught one of the medievalist classes yesterday, and it was on Christianization, and I read some of the bits from Kristni Saga. I love that story. I just think it's so great. It's just good storytelling, interesting to be like, and then he puts his thing over his head and thinks about it, and then they have little discussions about who they're going to sacrifice in order to get it to go their way. And I was like, oh, I don't know. I just think it's brilliant, but. So do you see on balance just a story about farmers, or do you see a story about a warrior culture? Who are they in that regard?
Ooh, yeah, that's an interesting one. I think there is a preoccupation with the sort of like old-fashioned ideology of honor
Yeah.
in a lot of these stories, because honor, well, at least the way I read it, would have been some sort of like a sort of currency to measure your value as an individual. So that's a prevalent theme. But then at the same time, it's also exploring ways to like overcome that old-fashioned culture. It's some sort of reflections, I guess, on the elites of the past and how they were dealing with power, how they were reacting to power. And there is also this like moral tendency to like keep it a little bit under control, like from a Christian perspective. So I think it's like sort of mix between new values and, I wouldn't say older values, I would say the values that medieval Icelanders tended to associate their ancestors with. So there is one saga that I I think is relevant as an example, which is the saga of the Confederates, Bandamanna saga, and this is like sort of like a funny story because it kind of like mocks aristocracy in general, because there is this group of aristocrats who like kind of like plot together to seize the wealth of someone, of a protagonist called the son of the protagonist called Other, and then you have the protagonist Ófeigur, who uses both like honorable methods in order to save his son, like trying to persuade the others to engage in a rightful lawsuit, for example. But then he also uses methods such as bribery or stuff that would have been that honorable. So it's sort of like a mix of values that we see here. Yeah, so the plot is basically about assuming control, about how to deal with laws, either in a moral or in a less moral way, and like trying to orchestrate this whole story in order to defeat the other chieftains somehow. So I think that through these actions, the actions of Ófeigur, I think we can see that the saga is really struggling in its concepts of honor and how acceptable that would have been in society. So there is definitely a social cultural transition to be seen here from like these old warrior ideals, so to speak, towards a more civic culture, but at the same time a more feudal culture, like you used to have in medieval Europe. And you do have like characters like Gunnar from the old saga, who's like the epitome of this old warrior type ideal. And you even hear him after he dies, because he keeps on staying near his mount after he dies, and then he recites poetry. So he really has this image of the noble heathen wanting revenge, but at the same time he's like haunting there, lurking there in the shadow. Like, okay, he's egging on Skarphedin and his friends to go kill his killers, but then at the same time he is very representative of this ancient culture. So there is a contradictory relationship, I would say, between all these concepts, both new and old.
Yeah, that makes me think of it just makes me think of Snorri, actually, just because of, the moment he's writing it down. And for those out there who may be listening who don't know, I mean, Snorri dies in 1241. And so this early 1200s where he's doing this, that, I mean, this is a crucial time, like you say. I mean, we're still a few decades away from, the takeover by the Norwegian crown, but it is the period of like, yeah, these older ideals are sort of, receding into the mist, and they're becoming something new, even to the extent of then, him embodying going from the oral to the written culture, heathen to Christian, warrior to old school warrior to new school warrior or feudal lord or whatever. So yeah, I think there's a sense to me of like, even just with him, that the writing of it down is like, let's get it down before it's lost, because things are changing. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a reflection on of the past, definitely, and that it's a written culture that deals with these like major topics that would have been relevant in history at the time. So power relations, heritage, genealogy, connections, and I think all of this was done in order to consolidate this new social identity that was emerging quite powerfully in the 13th and 14th century. Yeah, and these stories were canonized, if I might use this term. Like we have a dense network of stories that were being shaped at the time, and I also like the fact that these stories were also very diverse. I mean, you don't not only have the stories about what the settlers were doing, you also have stories about the very, very ancient past from the migration period. Like in a couple of legendary sagas, of course, the Volsunga saga is the most well-known examples, but there are others as well, the saga of Gonguhrolfr or the saga of Hervor and Heidrek. So they were preoccupied with this aspect of history as well, like what was going on the continent, in the sense of maybe like unifying or creating a stronger bond with the culture of medieval Europe. And that would have also been the point of the chivalric sagas, like these sagas which thematically they deal with the knights and so on, which are rather translations from authors, continental authors, such as Marie de France and Chrétien de Troyes and so on. So there is also this need to like be more open to the continent, you know, because now you're part of the Norwegian crown, and you're like part of Europe as well. So this sense of isolation is also something that the authors of the sagas would have wanted to overcome.
When you're talking about the legendary sagas, and you know, if they're going back that deep in time for them, like to the migration period, etc. I mean, where do you think they're getting their information from as they're writing these stories?
Oh, yeah, that's a tricky one. Well, I think that would have been a mix of information. They would have been familiar with the work of Saxo Grammaticus as well, and with other materials circulating at the time because of the connections they would have had with the Norwegian court. At the same time, we do have all these terms describing the sagas, like legendary sagas and Islendingasögur and so on. And it's really problematic because you have them in terms of genres, but maybe a better term would be like mode, like what they were interested in. Like this is something that Northrop Frye uses in literary theory, because you can see a preoccupation with the supernatural, for example, across all these modes or genres. So there would have been a lot of material circulating and recirculating, and also changing quite a lot over the passage of time. And you also, with reference to the Volsunga saga, you also have a lot of visual references, like visual culture, ranging from, I don't know, the Ramsund runestone in Sweden to the stave churches in Norway. So those stories would have circulated pretty much everywhere. Yeah. I have a lot of Middle High German material, ballads as well. And at some point, they came up with the idea of writing something themselves in a more Icelandic version.
Yeah. I mean, it is interesting to think about as far as the Icelanders go. I mean, you know, they do their own thing, like you were talking about, you know, the date being specific as far as settlement goes. I mean, which is really easy to do when nobody's there, right? And so then you're you know, it's easy to track. So, and then
except for the Irish monks.
Yeah, well, yeah, but you know, if they don't stay, then. But my friend David, who worked in Iceland for a number of years, you know, talks about them as far as the ways that they represent a diaspora community, and that they go there and they are, you know, they're doing something new, they're getting away from something, but they still have a connection to that something, right? And so there's this interesting kind of hybrid culture that sort of develops because they are in a new place and trying to forge something new. And yet there is this connection to the old. And it sort of always makes me think of like, okay, when we talk about kind of Vikings and the Viking Age and all of that stuff from that period, it's like, are the Icelanders really part of that? Or, you know, because you can read like Egil Saga and be like, okay, yeah, he's a Viking warrior for sure, you know, kind of thing, maybe. But it's like, or are they just kind of these farmers on this rock in the middle of the North Atlantic and kind of inventing who they are a little bit, you know, as this new thing that's based on an older thing that they've left behind, kind of, as that makes sense.
Yeah, again, I think they have a very contradictory relationship with the concept of Viking, or with the concept of Berserker, for that matter.
Yeah.
Because in many of the sagas, they are negative characters. I
Yes.
mean, they're like these plundering bastards who just won't go away. They're like
Yep.
very, very negative opinion about them. But then, yeah, you also have heroes such as Aegis Katla who are more or less presented as the epitome of an ancient heroic past that needs to be somehow integrated into this new Christian world. So I think that's a very contradictory relation there as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, Ael's an interesting. I have read that saga, and he's not a likable person.
No.
Yeah, and he's like killing somebody for the first time when he's like 6 or 7 years old, and then he wants to go out raiding with his uncle, and then they don't want to take him, and so he like destroys the ship. I'm like, he's totally got anger management issues, but I also think that, the interesting human arc of then the story of, what happens when a warrior ages out, right? And
Yeah,
I
yeah,
don't know if you've
yeah.
ever read that old article by Carol Clover from the 90s about sex and gender and power and everything in the Viking Age. But, she talks about sort of how they apply these various attributes of, so like basically old warriors like Egil when he's 80, become sort of weaker and, sort of more feminine in their eyes, because they're just not the virile men that they used to be. But it's just kind of funny to think, oh, you're just such a creepy, not very nice guy. And then, you see what happens to him when he's older and the women in the house are kind of kicking him around and stuff. And you're just thinking, there's consequences to being a jerk. And then I think at the end, like, I think the slaves took the money and ran. I don't think it's
I
very fair. And I don't think he killed them.
I find his relationship with his daughter towards the end quite endearing, at any
Yeah.
rate.
Yeah.
And also yeah, I really like the religious tension as well, going on, when he is very upset because his son died and
Yeah.
he's
Yeah.
losing. Yeah, he has a great loss as a parent. I think that's one of the few examples in the sagas where you can see like actual trauma going on, like
Yeah.
in a very direct way, with the poem Sonatorek, and all that. But yeah, the conclusion is also a bit fashioned. I mean, okay, my son died, but at least I can write poetry now. So that's that's also something quite old-fashioned.
Yeah, actually, that's interesting what you just said there about trauma, because I think about that too with regards to like, okay, again, you're sort of what is the broad view of what this culture is like? And it's, I mean, it's almost cliche for, at least for medievalists to sort of like, yeah, the Middle Ages is a relatively violent time. But what does that mean in their terms? And I remember I had Jesse Byock, I know him pretty well, and
Mhm.
we were talking about this at one point because I said, what is the old Norse word for violence? Like, did they, when we look back and we say, wow, those people were violent, but like, would they have looked in the mirror and said, wow, we're violent? Like, did they have the same concept of that as we do? And then also, sort of the same then propensity to suffer trauma as a result of violence in the way that we do. I mean, I tend to think that in many ways, like things like PTSD are kind of a
Yeah.
modern invention because our lives are not violent on a daily basis in a way that maybe it would have been in
Mm.
the past, right? And so when you have it being less normalized, then of course and then when you're subject to it, it is more traumatizing. But to think about like, okay, well, what happens? I've had this conversation with other friends in this field too, of like they go away on these boats and they come back, and maybe
Yeah.
raiding is not a fun experience, probably from either side of it, right? And
Yeah.
you're killing people maybe, or enslaving people, or whatever you're doing, and then you come back and maybe you're injured or whatever, and it's like, what does it take you to sort of reintegrate into your society, and what kind of things would they have felt, or is it pretty much just a normal day of the week for them? I'm trying to sort of kind of get a sense of that part of this culture as well.
Yeah, I'm wondering if this isn't something that can be applied even to the image of the berserker. I mean, because this image has always been associated with like this maybe sort of cult or semi-organization of at least a bit of those armies, in the sense of Odinic rites and so on and so forth. But when you think about it, that could also be considered somehow a coping mechanism
Yeah.
for what was going on the battlefield, like this whole war propaganda, and so on. I mean, there we do have hints from skaldic poetry as well, that not everyone would have liked this idea of, yeah, okay, you die and then you go to Valhall, so be happy about it, because the Valkyria with meat is going to be waiting for you, and you're going to be enjoying that forever, for all eternity, until Ragnarok. And then you die again, or whatever.
Yeah.
But not everyone. I don't think everyone would have been that thrilled about such aspects. So yeah, you would have needed to like develop pretty hardcore ideology in order to like convince these people that the violence was all a part of it.
Yeah, I
And
think
when
oh, go ahead, go ahead.
yeah. No, I just wanted to say that when you're trying to explain that in mythological terms, you have way higher chances of like determining people to get things done. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think I know, I can't remember who it is now, but in having this conversation with other people, somebody mentioned that somebody actually has done a study, and I don't know if it was just an article or a book about berserkers and like PTSD and like really making that connection or arguing for making that connection. Um,
Mm.
but I mean, Judith, yes, she wrote back in, I don't know, when was this? I think it was about 2009. It was a chapter in an edited volume anyway, that it was about like poetry and the warrior ideal. And she used the sort of the, what is it? The beasts of battle motif, or feeding the beasts in the
Yeah.
battlefield,
Yeah.
all of that, right? But that it's kind of this, um, I've done some research on this too, as far as even on the modern sense of it, what it means. That what do you have to do as far as creating these ideologies, these codes of honor, these ethical codes, etc., that reinforce what it means to be a warrior or a Viking or whatever, and that you're going to get people to do stuff that's pretty distasteful or can be very
Yeah.
dangerous or whatever. And so, how do you get them to do that and be okay with it, or help them understand that this is who we are as a culture. And so this is a sort of an educational process of, they hear these poems over and over again, especially if, from a younger age. And then it's sort of like, this is what you do. This is what you don't do. This is how to be a proper warrior. You never turn your back on the battlefield. You always make sure you save your brethren out there, or whatever that happens to be. And there's just so much research about that, even in the modern era. And so I ended up reading a book based on my friend David. He actually recommended it, called The Code of the Warrior. And it's a woman who was teaching military ethics at the United States Naval Academy for many years. And just sort of talking about, like, hey, like, what is a warrior and why does a warrior need a code? And part of it, at least for her in this modern sense, is that the code is something in order to live by, so that you can kind of in your brain justify why you are going out and doing things like killing other people on behalf of your government, or whatever, that is otherwise, a distasteful thing to do, but you have to somehow rationalize that and then be able to live with it afterwards.
Yep.
And the way to do that is to say, I'm Drengr, it's like there's a higher ideal going on
Or
here.
I'm an animal. I shapeshifted into a bear,
Right.
I shapeshifted into a wolf, and now I
Yeah.
am more than a human.
Yeah, no, they don't want that. They're like, I am a human. I have to deal with this. And so this is how I do it. We don't kill everybody all the time anywhere. There's only certain times, certain places, certain reasons why we engage in this kind of, warfare or that type of activity. And so, I mean, it's interesting for me to think about that, as a concept for back in the Viking Age, because as, like you said, I mean, we know with the concept of things like Drengr and the honor code that seems to sort of underscore at least part of that culture. It feels like they're also sort of trying to live with the fact that they are animals and they need to sort of
Yeah, there are plenty of references at Drengskaper also in the Icelandic sagas, like the story of Thorstein, the Staffstruck comes to mind. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it also runs in the family. If you don't conform to these social ideals, like you would have been a bit marginalized and considered arger or something.
Yeah, right, right, exactly. So, I mean, all cultures do that though, right? I mean, there's social mores and different ways that you have, where you're putting curbs on people to make sure
Mm.
that they act appropriately. Otherwise, the whole thing is just going to fall apart. Which I tend to think about that with actually Jesse talks about the establishment of the all thing and that I mean you mentioned the word democracy. I mean he uses the word proto-democracy, which I think
Proto-democracy, yeah,
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 I
yeah.
think it's
Mm.
fair on some level. I mean, it's certainly different than what's going on in other places. And you just sort of have to wonder, like, okay, is this a culture that just sort of has kind of an innate understanding that, like, if we don't at least try this, we're just gonna get embroiled in feud left and right. And it's just, you can't sustain a community like that. You have to sort of make rules for that, right?
Yeah, no, they had a very original system, definitely. And with all this mix between, networking and arbitration, compromise, and so on, they kept society going. I mean, I don't really see how else you could have functioned if you didn't have like a government and executive power, or any sort of head of state in order to ensure that those laws were respected. So you had to like impose it on yourself to do that. So in that sense, yeah, it was much more democratic than anything else we can imagine from the Viking age, from medieval Europe in general.
Yeah.
But then, yeah, you also had these differences, with the 39 chieftains eventually becoming 48, and then everything degrading in the age of the Sturlungs.
Right,
So,
right. Yeah. Then it gets really ugly in the 13th century. Oh,
yeah.
all they did was just create the conditions of which the Norwegian king's like, yep, it's done
Yeah,
for
gamla
you.
Southmalia.
Hey,
Hmm.
man, they had a good run, I think. What is that? 3 centuries, 3.5 centuries, almost. I think that's a pretty good
Yeah,
run.
pretty good. Yeah.
Um, so what do you think the sagas say to us about the state of or the lives of women in that period, or at least in Iceland?
Oh, yeah. So, I would say women are rather portrayed quite stereotypically. I mean, we do have some strong characters, definitely, but they tend to be depicted stereotypically. Like you have the image of the sorceress, you have the image of the wetter, in particular, Hallgerd and Bergthora from the saga.
Yeah.
Um, and you also have a couple of shield maidens, quite interesting. Like Hervor is one of my favorites, and she's a very interesting character because I like that she's comes back to this role of a woman quite smoothly. Like nobody criticizes her. Like she was a maiden, she maiden at the beginning. She used to go to the forest and rob people and whatever else she did. But then she marries and she settles after getting the cursed father from her, the cursed sword from her father's tomb. And yeah, she was now a woman as one would have expected from her, which is very bizarre. The fact that the author is so permissive of this sort of attitude. But yeah, generally speaking, I think the view on women is quite clichéistic. Like they're full of stereotypes. But one way to really gain power would have been to engage in this activity of prophecy and sorcery, yeah, soothsaying, and yeah, visionary activity, that sort of thing. That would have ensured you a little bit of agency, I would say, in a world that didn't really grant you any sort of like political power. So also in matters of authority, I think they were very limited, but in matters of agency, I do think that some of them at least would have actually benefited from that. And yeah, other authors are really not that permissive as the author of Hervor and Heidrek. Like I can think of another legendary saga among my favorites, which is the saga of Hrolf Kraki.
Mm.
And there you have um, quite interesting women characters. In my opinion, the most interesting one is the witch, the elven woman Skuld. Who actually defeats Hrolf Kraki in battle. And despite the fact that the author quite mentions quite explicitly that after this battle she does manage to rule the kingdom, he is still very dismissive of her because she defeated this great hero of ancient times, who was Hrolf Kraki, and yeah, she was a witch, and we're supposed to hate her. So
So is it because she defeated him or because she was a she who defeated him?
Yeah, because she was a she,
Yeah.
would be my guess. Yeah,
Yeah. Well, that's always the thing with the Viking Age too. And I have to, with my students too, I think there's a sense of like they want the shield maiden thing to be real full
mm,
stop and sort of normalized, right?
too much like
And
Arthurian.
yeah, and I just yeah. And I have sort of like issues with that just in a sense of like it's a curiosity to me why, it just says way more about us than it does about them, right? That we need that to kind of be a
Absolutely, yeah.
thing. And also just that I don't like the easy dismissal of that kind of soft power, It's sort of like,
Mm,
all right, well, who's cooking your food and making what you wear and everything else? I mean, good luck surviving without that. So like why is the domestic thing seen as such a sort of demoralizing, whatever? It's like, well, somebody's got to do it. And I just have to sort of imagine a little bit that probably to a fair amount, at least in the West, like we get and in America, we get this idea, it's very Victorian, right? It's
mm.
this kind of, sort of cult of domesticity and all this kind of stuff. And I just sort of have to think that back, 1200 years ago when, first and foremost, regardless of anything else, sort of subsistence is just sort of the name of the game, right? And then who's parsing out, well, I'm not going to do the dishes because that's your job. You're the woman, I'm the man, whatever. It's like nobody gives a shit. Like it's just somebody has to do it. So just do it,
Right.
kind of
Yeah.
thing. And so I just find it interesting, the way that we always sort of, just project. And those people maybe back then would be like, I don't know, we don't really think about it that hard, you know?
Yeah, I really do enjoy the images in the sagas and generally speaking, the Viking images that have to do with women doing textile work, because well, on the one hand, it was such an important economic activity, generally speaking,
Yep.
and secondly, it's very much associated with this idea of power in the sagas because they're sort of like creating something, and a mythological parallel would be and as in shaping destiny, or shaping things as they are set in motion, and because you start with the raw material and then you actually shape something that is very coherent, and that would be an interesting parallel to like life in general. Like we do have a couple of examples where heroes die, for example, or some character dies while the woman is spinning or weaving. So that's a very interesting parallel to draw here. Yeah.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Well, and then who was it? It was Michelle Hoyer Smith, was it, that wrote that
Yeah,
article like
yeah.
a year and a half or 2 years ago? Actually, and I've got my copy now. They just co-edited with Alexandra, my supervisor, a book about women in the Viking Age. So they've got a collection of essays that just came out, I don't know, a couple months ago or something. But she got some, that was in what was it, like a Scientific American, or I don't know, that was in like a big sort of more general kind of magazine or journal that talked about her conclusions on what was it, the weaving in Greenland or something, but just the whole idea of homespun and how important it was
Mm.
economically, so women making these important contributions to the economy. But there again, I have to say there was a little bit of it too where it was just like, okay, it feels like we're stretching it for our modern sensibility to say, see, look, women played an important role in the economy by weaving these things, and it's like, okay, like, I don't know. It's like we keep needing them to be like this,
Yeah, we need them to be active. Yeah, they're going to be passive bystanders. They have to be doing something.
it's
Either
like,
sword fighting or, textile work, just do something.
exactly. It's like,
Yeah, yeah.
why is it better if they're like on the boat with a sword and shield and versus, by the cooking pot, Like, I don't understand that.
Yeah.
But anyway. Yeah, I mean, well, and you mentioned earlier sort of the Droiker. So what to I think that's also very kind of cool and interesting to them that maybe we don't think about a lot, or at least I don't know, maybe I'm making a generalization about like maybe American culture or something. I mean, an ancestor dies, maybe you go to the grave, once or twice a year or something, I don't know, pay some respects or whatever. But I think to me that world back there feels like, at least with these stories, that it's way more porous, and that the people who have passed on can still interact with the people who are here. So I don't know, what's your reading about that?
Yeah, I think first of all, the borders between the supernatural and the natural would have been very different, yeah, porous, as you said, and also the borders between life and death. But yeah, we do have a lot of characters who come back from the dead in the Icelandic sagas. It was not just an Icelandic phenomenon. You have quite a lot of examples from medieval Europe too. So I particularly like the stories of Tittmar of Merseburg, for example, has these horrific stories about monks who get killed
Yeah.
by people who attend masses at dawn, which is yeah, okay, Tittmar. But yeah, you have a couple of interesting characters. So in the sagas of the Icelanders, your typical revenant. By the way, they're rarely called draugar or draugar in modern Icelandic. They're usually either not named at all, or they're sometimes called afturgangar, like literally the ones who come back. But yeah, draugar is not really a term used that or as often as we think. But yeah, in the sagas of the Icelanders, we usually have these people coming back to haunt the living for different reasons. Either they are dissatisfied with something that happened in their lifetime, or they want to preserve a social position they used to have in their lifetime. So generally, it's something very social, as far as I've noticed, and the relationship with the community is not cut off. So they're still part of that world, albeit in a very in a very disturbing way, because when they come back, they tend to be very violent, but not all of them. Those who are violent generally are presented as people who were either heathens or they didn't fit into society for whatever reason. We have, for example, Thorolfur from Erbylja saga, which is one of my favorite sagas. And he's this very violent character. He's described as having died in his seat after a fight with his son Ankel. And that fight was because of some woodland that he lost. And then his son refused to go in a lawsuit with Snorri Goði, who was one of his enemies, and so on. So he's very mad because of that. And he dies of anger sitting. And it's very interesting, intriguing the way it is described what they do with this character, because they dig a hole in the wall and they remove his corpse through that hole, so to prevent him from coming back. The people in the house are also advised not to go in front of him to prevent him from seeing them or whatever. So that they do take precautionary measures. He still comes back. He comes back a couple of times, as a matter of fact, and he essentially destroys all economic activity in that area, which is very bad in itself. And he does calm down once his son moves his corpse. But what I find very interesting is that in the first instance, his son actually refuses to destroy his corpse, because one way of getting rid of revenants in Icelandic sagas is like burn them. Like cremation is one of the very few instances where you have cremation in the sagas. They generally, when they tackle the idea of death, they have mounds or inhumation, generally speaking, but cremation, it's like only for this type of characters. Right. So yeah, he keeps on hunting, and he eventually turns into an evil bull after his ashes are eaten by a cow. And the interesting thing is that after he turns into this bull, who also has a name, his name is Klesir, he, as a bull, he takes revenge on the man who killed his son, Arnkel, because he will end up being killed. So this is interesting, because in a way, even if he's dead, he's still very much involved in that feuding society and then that conflict that is going on. Yeah, so that's one type of character you can find, but there are also more tamed characters, so to speak. So in the same saga, you're going to find a woman called Thorgunna. So Thorgunna is presented as a Christian. So we don't really have that kind of like otherness based on religious identity, but she's also presented as someone kind of like antisocial. She doesn't really talk a lot, and she's just weird. She also has a different origin. Speaking of otherness, how otherness is constructed in the sagas, one way of doing that is by showing that people have other origins. So she's Hebridean. So she's a bit different than the others. She's not Scandinavian, and she's also presented as having this great treasure, especially bed linen. She has very precious bed linen. She comes to work at a farm. She does that for a while, but then she has like this vision of raining blood, which is very like it's a very metal vision. I really like it. And afterwards, she dies, and she also requests before her death to be carried to a place called Skalholt, which will become the seat of the bishop. So she's very much integrated into this sort of like Christian ideology, so to speak. And also, if you look at her actions after her death, she's again presented as a character, okay, at the border between these two worlds, but then she's actually like more Christian in the sense that she comes back to life in a pretty weird context. At some point, the bearers of the coffin, they have to stop and they request hospitality from a farm, and they get it, but they don't get any food, so they get only shelter. And Thorgunna comes back to prepare food for them. And it's a very disturbing image because she's naked. She's an old woman who is naked. Now, this might have to do with her, only being wrapped up in a shroud, as the Christian custom was at the time. But then it might also have to do a little bit with this fear of, sexuality associated with elderly women and so on, more or less intentional. And after she provides food for these people, she is at peace for a while, because the story goes on. The story goes on, and she does get involved in a more violent way with the community, but not really because of something that she does or wants to do, but because the bed linen is not burnt, because she specifically requested that this property, these goods, be burned. So she doesn't want any grave goods. Speaking of constructing Christian identity, this is another element. But because these goods are not burnt as she wished, this causes a reaction, and you end up with a bunch of ghosts plaguing this farm. And to cut a long story short, you have the boy who's Kjartan, so the main character at this farm, who manages to like banish all these ghosts by organizing a door court. So he basically summons all the ghosts and he tells them, we understand that you like hanging out in the hall. It's pretty cool, it's warm, but you're not part of this world, so you need to piss off. And it's a very interesting episode because the ghosts actually understand that, and they leave. So they are aware in some way of this barrier.
Yeah.
This again reflects a little bit the tension between life and death, and who belongs where. So the ghosts want to be part of this world, but then, for the living community, long term, it might not be optimal. So you have a lot of ghosts in this story, and which is why I love it. I love Erbygja saga because it shows us that this obsession with realism that we usually have, that scholars used to have with the sagas, like the sagas of the Icelanders are realistic and they're historical, and you have the legendary sagas full of supernatural elements and berserkir and whatever and dragons. But then you see these episodes and you see how well integrated everything is, like magic and the paranormal and so on, and you realize how complex and contradictory the thoughts of these people were, and how they tried to make a coherent story out of it. So I absolutely adore it.
Yeah, I can admit, because that makes me think of so many things. Well, one, it's just a matter of like, you just want to sit around the fire and listen to somebody just completely like improv, right? And just like riffing on like, and then they did this and then that, and then like all these sort of, you're just like, no, you're full of shit. They did not do that. Like, it's just like, just this wild stuff. Then of course that gets to the whole sort of, the orality versus like, oh, darn it. And when you write it down, then it's like, oh, it just freezes it at that moment and it makes it less fun, right? The possibilities all of a sudden just vanish, right? That could have changed. the other thing that makes me think of too is just as far as tropes go in stories, like in the previous one you were telling him, like why, I mean, he's just such a jerk and he just keeps messing with things and he ruins the economy or whatever. And it's like, what is the purpose that he is serving in that story? You know, what is the is there a moral to the story, right? Or is it just nothing? It's just no, this guy was just a mean ghost and he wrecked everything. The end. You know, I mean,
Well,
what?
he does have a function in the end because, like I said, he's still integrated into the feud, and he is the one who manages to avenge his own son. So he has a functional story, a functional role in the story, and he keeps the story going. And the same thing goes for Thorgunna. With Thorgunna, I think it's even more important because it is her story that offers this boy Kjartan the possibility to gain some status because he also had quite a liminal position. He was born in a marriage, but it wasn't his father. So his mother had some extramarital affair, which caused a lot of tension in her family. Her family did not accept him. I mean, his status as a legitimate child. And this is one point. So he being the one organizing this lawsuit with the help of his uncle Snorri Goði, this is a point where he manages to confirm his identity and his identity as a member of the community and to gain some status. Kirsi Kanerva wrote a couple of articles about this, really showing that all these revenants like share this function when they're in relation with other characters, living characters. They do serve this function of showing how other characters can progress by integrating them in the story.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, it's just so
There's so much to talk about. Yeah.
I mean, it is. It's just really interesting and to think about, well, I mean, again, too, kind of going back to the sort of that porousness of, you know, not only with these ghosts or whatever, but I think just in a general sense of looking at a culture that lives, I try to explain this to my students in sort of a way of like, they live in the world, right? They are, you know, there's that phrase like, usually I've seen it in relationship to like Christian monks in the Middle Ages. We are in this world, but not of it, right? So we're trying to be, you know, above it somehow. But I don't think it does not feel that way to me for sort of heathen era, Viking era, whatever, in Scandinavia, that there's just, well, I mean, it's a sensibility that I do think comes with Christianity, at least in part, of this separation, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, humans get made and then they you know, they get the dominion over everything and all of that. And so that implies separation. And then also the sort of idea that then you can, you know, that the world is sort of this gift given to you by God, right? And that you can sort of bend it to your will and do whatever you want. I mean, I think we're still in some ways sort of engaging in that type of thinking. And it's, you know, it's like it's not working out so well in a lot of cases. But it's so hard for us to try to get in the headspace of that kind of life where they just view what it means to be a human on this planet in such a different way. And they're just so much more, at least to my mind, they're just so much more integrated than we are. And I think there's things to learn there, but yeah. So, I mean, what interested you? I mean, so when you sort of switched and started to then, you know, study these things, I mean, if you're like, okay, if somebody goes, here, read this saga, like what's the very first one you read? And then it would be like, oh, well, this is interesting. And then do you just kind of go down a rabbit hole? Wait, I can't see it from your background thing. Is
So
it
this is
Erbigja?
Erbigja Saga.
Erbigja Saga, okay.
Yeah. I actually don't remember what the first saga was that I read, but Erbigja Saga is my favorite. Yeah. I don't know. So besides Erbigja Saga, I really like the saga of Hrolf Kraki. I really like Gongu Hrolf's sagas. I kind of like this whole area of legendary sagas because they were very much dismissed until I think a couple of decades ago. But the post-classical sagas are also very interesting, like Bardar saga, Snæfellsnes, for example. So that troll-like man living on the peninsula of Snæfellsnes. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I think there is interesting stuff to discover from all of these categories. What I'm not particularly fond of are the contemporary sagas dealing with the whole upheaval in the Sturlungar
Yeah.
age. I rather prefer the ones dealing with the ancient past, with the ghosts and whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a reflection of a
Yeah, but
different time.
with the sagas, the thing is that I came to the sagas much later. So during my PhD, I was very much into the Eddas. So yeah, it was kind of like an evolution. I think that's a logical evolution because if you're dealing with the Eddas at some point, you're going to end up with the sagas as well. I mean, they were written kind of in the same period, more or
Yeah.
less.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But didn't you say earlier that you didn't care for the Edda? Maybe it was before we started recording that you didn't care for the Edda anymore, or you didn't, or did you
No, no,
say?
no. I said that I think it is have become a little overrated
Okay.
concerning the study of Old Norse mythology and whatever you find, especially online nowadays. And
Yeah.
anyone discussing Old Norse mythology, they're
Yeah.
way too focused on the Eddas. Yeah.
Yeah. So what should they be focused on, in your opinion?
Integrating material culture and archaeology. Yeah, a lot of Hedeaga, for example, has done some interesting work on that, and we do have now other possibilities of interpretation. Ranging from more contemporary approaches such as the concept of lived religion and the sociology of religion, to again this whole idea of memory studies. So yeah, we should try to diversify a little bit the sources and not just be obsessed with the Eddas, which in the turn have a lot of problems
Yeah.
when using them as a historical source for discovering mentalities people had in the 9th century. So
Yeah. Actually, I'm just reading Heidegger's The Iron Age Societies right now.
yeah.
And then I also have the same pile as what is it, Myth and Materiality or
Myth and
something?
materiality,
Yeah,
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 exactly,
yeah.
yeah,
A little
yeah.
bit later. Although her stuff, at least the Iron Age stuff, is fairly specific to Denmark. So I don't know if the other one, if it branches out beyond that very much. But yeah, I don't know. Well, I mean, and I think nowadays too, I mean, people are more used to integrating these things, I think, and seeing the necessity to do that than maybe they had been in the past. But
Yeah.
I mean, I know there's definitely been tension between archaeologists and historians in the past. And actually, let's see. Wait, I want to get this because it's kind of funny, I think. I was reading a book yesterday, a Swedish scholar, and where are you? It's down at the conclusion here. Hold on. I've got it highlighted. And he kind of gives this interesting little sort of jab at historians from, he's an archaeologist and he's working in Sweden. Oh, where are you? Come on. This is about the mead halls. And he talks about the migration period and then also the Vendel and then the Viking period. And oh, there it is. He says, to avoid the myopic study of individual sites and finds, archaeologists are forced to study the generalities of the longue durée. But we take heart in the fact that historians can say nothing whatsoever about our prehistoric regions and millennia. It's like, whoa, dude.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah. I was like, wow. Oh, but now we have to work together.
Yeah, I'm actually quite interested now in material culture myself. But again, material culture seen in the sagas, I think a lot of interesting things can be done here as well. I was looking, for example, at this is like an incipient study at instances of temples that are mentioned in the sagas, particularly temples of Thor. And how they are seen in what context, how they are related to like all these origin stories about ancestors and so on. Yeah, I did have a presentation at some point about the usage of swords in the saga. So yeah, how magical swords in the sagas can also inform a little bit the interpretation of them when found in the archaeological record, and this whole idea of personifying objects and what they mean to you and what they might have meant to the ones who buried you and chose those objects for you. So
Yeah.
like that kind of stuff. I think it's also useful.
Yeah. And the idea is actually about that, not related even to burial, but like the gift exchange economy. And I think it was Aaron Gurevich that wrote about that a bit as far as um, these objects. It's not just that I give you my sword, but I'm in that act, I'm also giving you part of me, right? And
Yeah,
so if you
yeah.
rejected that gift, it's not a rejection just of the sword, it's a rejection of me. So there's this whole sort of, yeah.
Yeah, as in the sagas, they're really presented as having that's the personality of their own, and they keep so many memories. They keep so much ancestry like solidified in these material objects. And yeah, again, you have Hervor, perhaps the best example, when she goes and requests the Tyrfinger sword from her father, and they do have like quite a tense conversation because her father refuses to give her the sword. But in the end, that is actually her argument that, this is my rightful heritage.
Yeah.
So give it to me and go back to Valhalla.
He's like, hey,
Yeah.
well, we need it there. That's what we do. We fight, we train.
Yeah.
I mean, it is interesting too to think that it's the sword. I mean, she could have asked him for something else, you know.
Right. Yeah.
Why is it that a weapon is seen as like the premier object? Then that suggests to me, I mean, this is a kind of a violent warrior culture, if that's what the
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
yeah. So I don't know. Well, so yeah, I'll have to figure out in my research then, how much I look at, what these stories have to say about who these people are and the culture that's arising, particularly in that period of time, that leads up into the Viking Age. Is sort of like, because it does, I mean, one of my sort of leading questions is what type of society can create a Viking Age?
Right.
And when you think about some of the things that happened earlier on in, say the 6th century, a lot of study about that, right, with the Dust Veil and, Justinian plague and other things, and
Mm,
even the fall of the Roman Empire, leaving a big void and everything, and then human beings
yeah.
just sort of, pushing the reset button on some level, and then it's like, okay, good, we could arise as any kind of culture. We could be like an egalitarian hippie commune. We could do like, we could be like, I don't know, communist China. Like, what do we do? We're like, just, we become, do this warrior culture thing again. And so to me, that's just a really, interesting question as to why that is, what that says about human beings at that time.
Yeah, I do think that it would have been an evolution, like a long-term evolution, it's just like a peak of it. And parallel to warrior culture, there would have been also quite the development of trading routes at the time. As there are these studies about the whetstones, for example, lately showing that a town like Ribe in Denmark would have had these tremendous connections with like Arctic Norway, where they got Western Norway, where they got the whetstones. So this shows that the trading routes had already been developing before the
Yeah.
9th century, the 8th century, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
And they go
So,
kind of like in parallel. I mean, I don't know. There is this tendency to, especially in popular culture now, to say that Viking is a pirate. Like, I think in every YouTube video I have, there is one person commenting, Viking is a pirate. Okay, thank you. I think it was a little more complex than that because they were quite opportunistic.
yeah, yeah,
So whatever fit best
yeah.
in the given context. So there would have been like both of them,
Yeah.
both raiding and trading going on, shaping this identity. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think so too. I mean, I absolutely do tell my students that. I mean, like if you're going to look for sort of the
Mm,
easiest English equivalent, it is akin to piracy, but there is a very tight connection
yeah.
between trading and raiding. It's like you can be legitimately trading, you can also be raiding, but then some of the trading on the other side of that is nothing more than just fencing stolen goods. So it's all interconnected with each other. And I think you use that kind of in that simplistic way just to sort of also just distinguish like a Viking's not an
Mm,
ethnicity, it's a subset, it's a subculture
yeah.
within a culture, it's only certain people did that. And so, yeah, it's not
Yeah.
everybody
And
wearing.
it's still difficult to talk about it. I mean, I will do a mea culpa here because in many of my videos, I do use the term Viking with reference to Viking Age, but instead of saying Viking Age, I just say Viking, which
Yeah.
is quite confusing.
Yep.
I shouldn't be doing that, but it's
Right.
also like a matter of choice because it's the stupid algorithm who prefers this term to Northmen or Norsemen or whatever.
Right.
Scandinavians living in the
Right.
Viking Age Scandinavia between the 8th and 11th
Yeah.
century.
Exactly. I literally just said that to my students on Tuesday. It's like, now that I've just schooled you in the difference, I'm going to make it confusing by just using the word Viking as a shortcut because it's easier to say than Scandinavians living between the 8th century and
Yeah,
totally.
yeah.
Well, and I don't know if you like saw that. It was been a couple of years ago, or I think it was 2022. Anyway, like Alex Wolff wrote that article about like we should get rid of the word Viking. We shouldn't be using it because it's too confusing, or whatever. And I'm like, just like, I get your point, dude, but I think the horse is way out of the barn. I think we just can't put that back in, if people,
no.
And plus,
Too late.
any scholar will tell you, like, if you want that book to sell, you just put the word Viking in the title somewhere, and publishers will go for it. But so I don't know. We've been talking for a while, maybe like last question or something, but at least for me, like in the work that I'm doing, would you think it would be helpful to read the sagas, or do you think they're just not worth much there as far as giving me the picture I'm looking for?
I mean, I guess you could look at the way one of the Viking diasporas is represented in later sources, if you're interested in that kind of stuff, and maybe compare it with how other diasporas came to being from that point of view.
So it would be sagas.
But they're not gonna, I mean, I don't know if they're gonna tell you that much about how everything started out. I think they would be less useful.
Yeah. But I mean, I don't even need to have like sort of like this is, well, I don't know. I think mostly, again, in sort of looking at just the culture that is reflected in those stories, is this the kind of culture that you would think is capable of creating a Viking age? How is it structured? What are the institutions that support that kind of activity? That kind of thing. Or are they just so much later that they're just kind of off the mark and it's not reflective of anything, or it's not really helpful?
Yeah, you can recuperate from it, as we previously discussed. You can recuperate from it bits and pieces of what they would have considered a heroic ethos.
Yeah.
In a way.
Yeah. The heroic age. Yeah. There's other people I know who've written about that too. So that kind of heroic age.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, this has been very interesting.
Yeah, it has. Yep.
Thank you.
Likewise.
Yeah, thanks.
If you made it till the end of the video, that is pretty amazing. Well done. And if you're still interested in the Viking Age, I do have many other materials for you. For example, in this video here, you can learn more about why the Viking Age started in the East. But if you're rather interested in the literature, so the afterlife of the Viking Age, I have a full lecture about the saga I kept mentioning in this conversation, the Erbygja saga. Thank you so much for watching or listening. This was Irina, and till next time.